The deserts of the Middle East have seen wars that shook civilizations, but few tales carry the same weight of strangeness, ferocity, and forgotten glory as the one about to unfold. Beneath the blinding sun of Jerusalem, a confrontation was about to take place that should have been impossible. On one side, 40,000 men marched with banners high, their horses' hooves shaking the ground, their war cries echoing across the sands. On the other, only 800 warriors from the far north, Vikings, men already tested in countless battles, standing in silence with shields gleaming and axes ready. It was not a battle between equals. It was a clash between overwhelming numbers and a kind of faith so consuming, so destructive, that it turned into a weapon sharper than steel. This is the story of how Viking ferocity fused with religious devotion to create one of the most brutal and shocking encounters of the 11th century. The year was 1064. The Holy Land stood at the crossroads of faith and blood, and in those burning deserts, history was about to be written in carnage. But the story did not begin there under the desert sun. It began far away, in the cold and misty lands of Norway, where King Magnus III ruled. He was known as Magnus Barefoot, a name earned not from weakness, but from his habit of wearing traditional Scottish garments, shunning the robes of kingship. By his reign, Christianity had spread across Scandinavia, but it did not erase the Viking spirit. Instead, it combined with it, creating something far more dangerous: warriors who carried the fury of the Norse and the conviction of holy zealots. Magnus was no ordinary king. Where other rulers saw politics and territory, he saw destiny. When Pope Alexander II called on Christians to defend sacred places, Magnus did not hear opportunity. He heard purpose. He envisioned a holy army unlike any other, men who would not simply fight as conquerors, but who would march as instruments of God's vengeance. Recruitment began, but Magnus sought not ordinary men. He demanded veterans, men hardened by decades of blood and steel, survivors of endless Nordic wars. From the start, he was clear: this force would be small, but it would be unbreakable. Each of the 800 chosen warriors had to prove 3 things: mastery with axe and sword, the ability to endure suffering without collapse, and above all, a faith so unshakable that death on the battlefield would be embraced as salvation. Their training was relentless. For months, these men lived in the shadow of preparation. They combined the old ways of Viking combat with newer techniques borrowed from Byzantine mercenaries. They drilled in formations, learned to strike in coordination, and trained to resist chaos when arrows rained down or cavalry broke against their shields. But what set them apart was not only their discipline, it was their faith. Each day began with prayer. Each meal was blessed, each weapon consecrated in the name of God. Monks and priests stood alongside them, forging not just warriors, but fanatics who believed their death would echo in eternity. Slowly, they ceased being soldiers of flesh and became something more terrifying: men who fought like berserkers, but with the clarity of divine purpose. When spring arrived, the fleet left Bergen. But Magnus did not set sail directly for the Holy Land. His strategy was patient. He wanted his warriors tested in fire before they ever set foot in Jerusalem. Their first stop was the Orkney Islands, where they recruited mercenaries accustomed to southern climates. From there, the fleet pushed southward, raiding along the coasts of Spain. The battles that followed were unlike anything the Vikings had faced before. They encountered Saracen warriors, swift horsemen, deadly with the bow, disciplined and precise. To the Vikings, this was a new kind of war. But in every skirmish, the lesson was the same. No tactic, no skill could prepare an enemy for the horrifying mix of Viking savagery fused with holy conviction. Again and again, smaller Viking forces threw themselves into hopeless fights and emerged victorious, fueled by fanaticism their enemies could not comprehend. By the time winter came, the fleet had reached Constantinople. Here, the expedition grew even stronger. The Byzantines, recognizing both the value and the danger of these northern warriors, provided them with upgraded weapons and armor. Steel gleamed sharper, shields grew heavier, and the men themselves felt invincible. When spring returned, they finally turned their sails toward the Holy Land. Word of their arrival spread like wildfire through the Muslim world. Yet no one trembled. 800 men were nothing against the vast armies guarding Jerusalem. For Emir Abu Nasr, also known as Shams al-Muluk, commander of Muslim forces in the region, the arrival of the Vikings was almost laughable. To him, they were not an invasion force, they were prey. He believed annihilating them would serve as a warning to all Christian armies who dared cross the sands. Confident and calculating, he gathered 40,000 troops, cavalry with armored steeds, mounted archers who could blacken the skies with arrows, disciplined infantry, and even siege engines designed to crush fortresses. Against such a host, the fate of 800 men seemed already sealed. The armies met on the arid plains southeast of Jerusalem, near the fortress of Herodion. The scene was staggering. On one side, Abu Nasr's army stretched for miles, its banners snapping in the desert winds, the thunder of countless hooves and boots shaking the ground like an earthquake. On the other side, a single square of Vikings stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields flashing beneath the merciless sun, their axes ready. They did not shout, they did not taunt. They stood in silence, waiting for the storm. Abu Nasr's plan was simple, a strategy that had crushed many before. His cavalry would encircle the Vikings, cutting off any hope of retreat. His archers would rain down death until their formation cracked. Then, his infantry would move in and sweep away what little remained. It was a perfect tactic, one that had never failed him. But on this day, it would face a force unlike any he had ever known. For Magnus and his warriors had anticipated this. They had studied these very tactics, preparing for them during their long months of training. Their formation was designed to withstand encirclement. Their discipline was forged to resist the chaos of endless arrows. And their minds were prepared for what Abu Nasr could not possibly imagine. These 800 men did not plan to survive. They had come to die, not as victims, but as martyrs. They intended to unleash such destruction in their final moments that their deaths would echo across the Holy Land. This was not a battle fought for life. It was a battle fought for eternity. At the first light of dawn, the desert quivered with the sound of Sarus war horns. Their blaring cries rolled across the barren land like thunder, announcing the charge of thousands of Muslim cavalry. The ground itself seemed to tremble beneath the pounding of hooves, a storm of riders advancing at full speed, scimitars catching the morning sun and flashing like silver lightning. It was a sight meant to terrify any enemy. Yet the men they were about to face were not ordinary soldiers. They were Norsemen, hardened warriors from the icy north, men who had endured storms, hunger, and wars that would have broken most others. Instead of standing shoulder to shoulder and bracing for the impact, they did something no commander in the desert had ever witnessed. They split apart. To the cavalry, it looked like chaos. To the untrained eye, it looked like fear. But it was neither. It was the execution of a tactic so daring, so precise, that would turn the battlefield into a graveyard for tens of thousands. The Vikings numbered only 800 against an enemy of 40,000. To most, this would have been a hopeless calculation, an equation where survival was impossible. But the Norse warriors did not measure battles by numbers. They understood something far more powerful than sheer strength, the psychology of fear. They knew that terror, once planted, could destroy an army faster than steel. And on this day, they would use that knowledge to devastating effect. Their commander divided them into 8 groups of 100, each forming a tight defensive circle. This was not a retreat, nor a desperate attempt to survive a little longer. This was the wheel of death, a battle formation forged through endless drills and perfected during their winter of preparation. Each circle was a fortress, each space between them a trap waiting to be sprung. When the cavalry thundered forward, expecting to crush a single solid line of defense, they instead found themselves funneled into narrow, killing grounds. Horses galloped between the circles, riders shouting in triumph, until the circles closed behind them. Suddenly, the cavalry was trapped, their momentum broken, their numbers useless. The Vikings struck from all sides at once, axes and swords hacking into flesh and steel, spears jabbing at panicked mounts. The first wave of riders experienced something they had never faced before. The Vikings fought not as individuals, but as if they shared a single mind. Every strike was perfectly timed. Every defense transformed instantly into a counterattack. To the Saris, it was as though they had stumbled into the grip of a nightmare. And then came the terror that truly shattered their spirit. These men from the north did not flinch when struck. They did not retreat when wounded. Many had entered the legendary berserker state, a battle frenzy that stripped them of fear, numbed them to pain, and filled them with an inhuman fury. But on this day, their frenzy was fueled by more than rage. It was supercharged by faith. These warriors believed with every fiber of their being that each enemy slain secured their place in paradise. They were not simply fighting to live. They were fighting to die well. To their enemies, it was as if they were facing men already dead, men whose only purpose was to drag others into the grave with them. From his vantage point, Abu Nazar at first remained calm. 1,000 men lost in the opening clash meant nothing to an army so vast. He ordered his mounted archers to take the field, to rain arrows upon the Viking circles and bleed them dry from a distance. Yet once again, the Norsemen revealed their foresight. During the night, they had raised crude barricades, scavenged from shields of the fallen and scraps of wood, stone, and debris. When the sky darkened with arrows, the Vikings crouched behind these makeshift walls, patient, silent, waiting. And when the storm passed, they did not simply endure. They rose to counterattack with weapons designed to horrify their enemies. War axes forged to split armor like firewood. Spears with hooks that tore riders from saddles in an instant. And most terrifying of all, a weapon carried from their time in Constantinople, an incendiary liquid akin to the Byzantine Greek fire. The Saris archers, unprepared for such ferocity, collapsed under the assault. What was meant to be a clean execution turned into slaughter. And worse still, the Vikings showed no hesitation in death. Wounded men, bleeding and broken, used their final breaths to pull enemies into the abyss with them. For every Norseman who fell, 3 or 4 Saris went with him. These are not mortals clinging to life. They were warriors embracing death as a gift. Abu Nazar now understood the scale of the challenge. These were not enemies who could be broken with cautious strikes. They had to be crushed outright. He gave the order to unleash his infantry, 20,000 men advancing in a great wave, determined to bury the Northerners under sheer weight. By midday, the sun burned mercilessly overhead as the Saris lines tightened around the Viking circles. The plan was brutally simple. Smother them. 25 soldiers for every 1 Norseman. No warrior, no matter how fierce, could withstand such odds. At least that was the belief. But the Vikings had saved their most devastating weapon for this moment. Hidden among their ranks were clay pots filled with their own variation of Greek fire, crafted during their stay in Byzantium. At the signal, they hurled them into the advancing horde. The desert erupted in flames. This was no ordinary fire. It clung to armor and clothing. It fed on the wind, roaring higher with every gust. It could not be extinguished with water. In an instant, the battlefield became an inferno. Panic spread like lightning through the Saris infantry. Soldiers screamed as they burned alive, their formations crumbling, discipline melting away in terror. From within the chaos, the Vikings struck. They burst from their circles, charging through fire and smoke, many wounded, some already aflame. They screamed ancient prayers in their own tongue, hacking through terrified enemies who outnumbered them dozens to 1. It was no longer a battle of armies. It was a vision of hell itself. 800 men tearing apart thousands in a frenzy of faith and fury. For the Saris, the sight was unbearable. Their minds broke before their bodies did. Desperate, Abu Nazar summoned his last hope, his personal guard. 2,000 elite warriors, veterans of countless wars, men who had never known defeat. Their mission was clear: strike down Magnus, the Viking leader, and break his warriors' will. The guard advanced, confident in their skill. Yet what they met on the battlefield was not simply a man, but a legend. Magnus towered above his foes, wielding a double-headed axe, said to have been blessed by the Pope himself. He was more than a commander. He was a symbol of unstoppable defiance. His very presence drove his men to greater fury and struck fear into the heart of his enemies. What followed was a clash within the greater battle, a storm of steel and blood where the finest warriors of two worlds met. For an hour, the outcome hung in balance. The Sarus Guard fought with the desperation of men who knew the survival of their army depended on them. The Vikings fought with the certainty that God had already chosen their victory. It was not just the collision of blades, but the collision of two visions of war, one born of numbers, discipline, and strategy, the other forged from faith, frenzy, and the embrace of death itself. Magnus and Abu Nazar stood face to face in the desert heat, two men whose fates were about to shape the destiny of thousands. Abu Nazar was no ordinary commander. He had been trained in Damascus's most prestigious schools of swordsmanship, where precision and discipline were drilled into him from childhood. He had survived countless duels, each one sharpening his reflexes, each one proving his dominance. His skill with the blade was unquestionable. He was the kind of warrior who inspired fear simply by stepping onto the battlefield. But on that day, his opponent was unlike any he had ever faced. Magnus was not just a Viking chieftain. He was the embodiment of northern ferocity fused with the rigorous training of European martial traditions. Every strike of his axe was carried not only by muscle and technique, but by a conviction that it was guided by the hand of God himself. The duel did not last long. Abu Nazar fought with all the precision and elegance of a master swordsman. Yet conviction is often stronger than skill. Magnus' sheer brutality, his relentless drive, and his unshakable belief that he was chosen for this moment carried him through. When the Vikings' axe finally tore through Abu Nazar's defenses and struck its fatal blow, the consequences went far beyond the fall of one man. It was the breaking point of an entire army. The Sarus soldiers who had begun the morning with confidence and pride suddenly froze in disbelief. Their leader lay dead at the hands of men they had mocked as barbarians. Could it truly be that this tiny band of northern fanatics was unstoppable? That single question spread like fire across the ranks, and with it came terror. But the death of Abu Nazar was not the climax. What followed was something far more terrifying. Instead of rallying, instead of retreating in order, panic exploded through the Sarus host. Logic disappeared in an instant. 40,000 men turned into a frenzied mass, trampling comrades, ignoring commands, driven only by the urge to escape. Officers tried desperately to rally their soldiers, but no one listened. In some cases, those who tried to restore order were cut down by their own panicked men. The battlefield descended into chaos. In the midst of this storm, Magnus raised his voice and gave a chilling order: no survivors. This was not a tactical choice. It was not about ensuring victory. It was extermination, sanctified by the belief that God himself had demanded it. What followed was not a retreat or a surrender. It was a massacre stretched across 3 long days. The Vikings pursued the fleeing Sarus army through the burning desert. They had spent months studying the land, learning every pass, every dry riverbed, every possible escape route, and now they used that knowledge to devastating effect. They blocked pathways, set ambushes, and cornered fugitives. But this was no longer just strategy. It had become ritual. Every time they captured a fleeing soldier, they executed him with prayers whispered over the body. To the Vikings, this was not cruelty or vengeance. It was holy work. Each kill was an offering, each execution a service to God. By the end of the first day, 10,000 Sarus soldiers were dead. On the second day, another 15,000 were cut down. On the third, the last remnants of the once proud army were hunted down like animals. When the dust finally settled, more than 35,000 men had perished. Of the 800 Vikings who had marched into the desert, only 230 had fallen. Their losses were heavy, but compared to the impossible odds they had faced, the victory was almost beyond comprehension. The consequences of this slaughter were immense. Word of the Viking triumph spread like wildfire across the Muslim world. In Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo, fear began to take root. It was almost impossible to believe that such a small Christian force could annihilate one of the region's strongest armies. Leaders and generals began to whisper the unthinkable. Perhaps the Christians truly could retake Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Magnus wasted no time exploiting his new reputation. He rallied Christian communities who had lived under Muslim rule for generations, men and women desperate for liberation. Within weeks, his small force of 800 had swelled to more than 3,000, every one of them fanatically devoted to the holy reconquest. But Magnus did not wage war like other commanders. What followed was not a campaign of slow sieges and calculated battles, but a campaign of terror. Every victory, no matter how small, was magnified through rumor and legend. Propaganda spread faster than armies. The Vikings were no longer seen as men, but as supernatural warriors sent by God. Cities surrendered at the mere whisper of their approach. Seasoned commanders, veterans of countless campaigns, refused to even face them in battle. Magnus' reputation had become his greatest weapon, more powerful than steel or fire. And yet, the story of this massacre did not remain confined to the deserts of Jerusalem. Decades later, as Pope Urban II prepared his call for the First Crusade, tales of Magnus Barefoot and his 800 warriors swept across Europe. Chroniclers exaggerated the events until they resembled myth. They wrote that angels had fought alongside the Vikings, that their weapons were blessed by miracles, that no arrow could pierce their armor. Whether the people believed every detail or not did not matter. The psychological impact was immense. Thousands of nobles and knights, hearing of this miracle in the East, became convinced that if they took the cross, divine victory was guaranteed. But this victory carried darker consequences as well. Magnus' actions set a precedent, creating a dangerous justification for absolute brutality in the name of faith. The methods of terror, pursuit, and ritual execution pioneered by his Vikings were copied by later crusaders again and again. Holy war became not just a matter of conquest, but of annihilation. Magnus himself would not live to see the long shadow of his deeds. He was killed in 1069 in battle against Turkish forces near Antioch. Yet even in death, his legend only grew. Songs were sung of his victories, churches were dedicated in his honor, and warriors invoked his name for courage, believing that calling on him could bring divine favor. The massacre revealed a timeless truth about war. Numbers alone do not decide battles. Morale, faith, and psychological dominance often outweigh sheer size. A small, unified, fanatically dedicated force could topple a giant army if it shattered their spirit. Once the Vikings earned their reputation for invincibility, that reputation itself became a weapon. Enemies surrendered before the fight even began. Allies joined them in droves. Campaigns were won not only with blades, but with stories. From today's perspective, the tale is both awe-inspiring and horrifying. It shows the heights and depths of human conviction. The same faith that allowed 800 men to slaughter 40,000 is the same fanaticism that fueled some of history's darkest atrocities. Belief itself is not inherently dangerous. It is the cause that belief serves. To the Vikings, they were instruments of God's will. To their enemies, they were demons unleashed upon the desert. Both views contain truth. The massacre of Jerusalem became legend, reshaping holy war for centuries. And even now, it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Was their devotion admirable, or was it monstrous? Perhaps it was both. What cannot be denied is that it was extraordinary. Proof that faith could move more than mountains. It could move armies, topple empires, and alter the course of history. And so, As the tale of Magnus Barefoot and his warriors comes to an end, we are left with a haunting lesson. A small, committed band of believers changed the fate of nations. Their conviction turned the impossible into reality. Their story is both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder of what humans can achieve when they unite under a cause greater than themselves, and a chilling testament to how far that conviction can be twisted when sanctified by blood.